Ladies and gentlemen, last time we talked about the Soviet Union at war in the most destructive war in modern history. If there can be a society entirely traumatized by events, I think that the Soviet Union was such a society. The psychic wounds, the material wounds, the loss of the national treasure was such that the nation, the peoples of the Union, the individuals that participated in the war could not recover really in their lifetime. So the scar of the war remained, and yet the war in May of 1945 had come to an end. Our subject for today is what happened after the war. I want to talk about the period from May of 1945 until March of 1953, Stalin's death. We will talk about the recovery from the war, such as it was. It was a partial recovery, and it was attended by many crises. And we'll talk about the last political maneuvers of Stalin before he shuffled off to be with the gods. First of all, the post-war crisis. May of 1945, Soviet citizens living in Moscow were invited to a splendid spectacle. The lights were turned on in the city at night for the first time in years, so that citizens understood there was no need to fear bombardment. And at midnight, there were fireworks set off in Kremlin Square, in the Red Square in the middle of town. And people who lived through the experience will tell you that it is one of the most emotional times of their lives. There are famous pictures, of course, in the United States, photographs of soldiers having returned from the front and joyously greeting their loved ones on their return. Well, something like that occurred in the Soviet Union in Moscow in May of 1945, but I think it must have been mingled with a complete exhaustion, an exhaustion of the will, an exhaustion that was physical and mental, that went to the very bones and the marrow of people's persons. That exhaustion was there because there were so many problems to which the Soviets had to attend. First of all, there were prisoners of war, German prisoners of war on Soviet territory, and Soviet troops and also civilians held in DP camps, displaced person camps, in various parts of Europe. Under the terms of the Yalta Agreement, was signed by leaders of the Great Alliance, there were ways in which soldiers and civilians were supposed to be treated while they were in displaced person camps, and then legally repatriated. Repatriations under the terms of this treaty were not completely voluntary, at least in the case of many Soviets. Soviet civilians, some Soviet soldiers who were in German camps and then taken by the Allies and put in displaced person camps, did not want to return home to the Soviet Union because they feared that they would be punished if they went back, or they feared that their lives would be immeasurably worse in the Soviet Union than if they were lived somewhere in the West. Under the terms of the Yalta Treaty, however, the Allied governments had no resort. There was no condition which permitted them to allow freedom of choice to the Soviet civilians and members of the armed forces that might want to stay in the West, these people had to be repatriated. So there is an aspect of coercion that is involved in the repatriation of some Soviet citizens and troops from west to the east. According to the estimates of Soviet officials in 1953, about 5.5 million Soviet soldiers or civilians were repatriated between 1945 and 1953. About 3.2 million of that number, of the 5.5 million, were civilians. So we're talking 2 million plus soldiers and 3 million and some civilians. Now, of the POWs, the soldiers that had fallen into German captivity, remember what I said earlier. The assumption of the Soviet authorities was that these people had collaborated with the Nazis, unless it could be demonstrated in absolutely irrefutable terms that that was not the case. The result of this assumption was that people went from captivity by the Germans to displaced person camps in the West, and then to captivity in the Soviet Union. This is an estimate made by the historians Nekrich and Geller, but they think that more than half of the 2.3 million soldiers that were in German captivity and then in displaced person camps in the West, more than half of these were punished by some form of incarceration or penal servitude when they returned to the Soviet Union. 20%, Nekrich and Geller tell us, 20% of these soldiers were sentenced to death on their return. Only about 20% of this remainder were allowed actually to return to their homes after they were liberated from the displaced person camps in the West. This is a case where a government's suspiciousness, rightly or wrongly, affected the lives of so many people who were probably patriotic and hoping for a good life. Now, the other side of the coin is something that I think we understand too little. I certainly, as a historian, have not read a good book on the subject of the POW camps on Soviet territory and the displaced person camps on Soviet territory. How were the Europeans who had somehow found their way into the Soviet Union, either through captivity or some other means, how were they treated there? Under what conditions did they live in the displaced person camps? How were they repatriated? As we pose the question, we realize that there isn't a good answer. I don't know the answer. There are some memoirs that give us a hint of what conditions might be like. For example, the great Italian chemist and survivor of Auschwitz, Primo Levi, who has left a wonderful description, if such a thing can be wonderful, describing what Auschwitz was like. When Levi was liberated from Auschwitz, like many of the inmates of the camp, he was sent to the east rather than to the west or the south. That is to say, he wasn't permitted to go to Western Europe or to return to his home in Italy. He first went to live in a DP camp, a displaced person camp, in the Soviet Union. And Levi surprisingly says that conditions were stark, they were Spartan, but the Soviets did what they could for the displaced person. So this is a case where the I would call it the unalloyed charity of Russian people, their surprising hospitality under terrible conditions, manifested itself. Of course, the country at large was xenophobic, so we have to look at this manifestation of kindliness to foreigners as something that is relative and maybe even exceptional. But nevertheless, Levy raises the question of whether the Soviets didn't try to treat prisoners from the West and displaced persons with some degree of humaneness. But I simply cannot say, on the whole, what conditions in camps were. It seems to me that this is a question that awaits its historian and detailed archival investigations. Now, there were also Soviet soldiers who were not captured, who simply, during the course of the war, remained with their units, and after the war, the government had to decide what to do with them. Reassign them, demobilize them, whatever. In most cases, the government chose to keep soldiers under arms for a time. So there didn't follow after the war the kind of rapid demobilization that occurred in the United States after the end of the Pacific War. Very quick, as military things go, demobilization of troops, so that within a few months the size of the Army and the Navy were a fraction of what they'd been at the height of the World War. That was not true in the Soviet case. Now why? Why did the government not quickly demobilize people? Well, the notion that you were somehow supporting an extraneous burden by keeping somebody in the army doesn't make very much sense in a state where industry was theoretically owned by the state, where the economy was planned by the state. I mean, it was simply a manpower decision in some ways, and also an ideological decision. There was a fear, I think, on the part of Soviet high officials that many soldiers who had been with the Soviet army as it went into Poland and as it went into Germany might be ideologically contaminated, might be tainted by having seen things in Poland and in Germany, in these bourgeois states, that maybe they shouldn't have seen. And so it was thought that it was better to keep these people under arms, to reassign them, rather than to permit them to come to the village and possibly to contaminate their neighbors with tales of what Poland and Germany were like. There is also a decision, I think, by the government to use the army for civilian purposes. If you have a number of million men under arms and they're not immediately called on to use those weapons, you can put shovels in their hand. You can make them do cleanup, and because they are hardened by the privations of the front and the discipline of the army, they can do the preliminary war cleanup presumably more efficiently than a civilian corps of workers could do. So this was another element in the government's calculation. All of these shifts of people, millions of people, from this camp to that camp, this direction and that direction, this army unit sent here to work and that one there. This movement of millions of people was not, even by Soviet standards, a normal situation. It was a response to something that was still a crisis. A crisis in how to deal with massive numbers of displaced people, how to do war cleanup, and so on. So this is one element of the post-war crisis. I have mentioned also a psychological problem that manifested itself. I mentioned Luria's work dealing with people that had head wounds. I just want to touch on this question again. When soldiers finally did come back to their villages, it was frequently the case, and we know this from memoirs, we know it from short stories that are quite realistic in depicting these soldier veterans, that they felt alienated from the village. They had maybe 4 years, maybe 5 years previously been the workers in the village that, on whom the future of the village depended, but they came back into a situation where older people, their parents, and their wives were used to making decisions. And they felt extraneous, superfluous. And it also felt for them very strange to be back in the village after living in trenches and out of doors bivouacked, and to return to normal life after seeing what they had seen. This also produced a sense of estrangement. So there's a psychological element in the post-war situation that I also think you could call a crisis. Now, another element of the post-war situation involves the peripheral areas where there had been fighting back and forth, where there had been German occupation, and where now the Soviet Union was reestablishing its presence. The Baltic states, the Ukraine, especially Western Ukraine, these were neuralgic points for the Soviet authorities as they reestablished themselves, or in some cases established their control for the first time. In Estonia and Latvia, collectivization of agriculture was to be imposed in the post-war period, imposed for the first time. Because in the brief period between 1939 and 22nd of June 1941, when Estonia and Latvia were being integrated into the Soviet Union, the government, the Soviet officials hadn't yet got around to collectivization of agriculture. So the consequences of the 1929 to 1933-34 collectivization in the center of the Soviet Union now make themselves felt in the Baltic states. And there was resistance. The resistance was especially harsh in Lithuania, but it was there in Estonia and Latvia as well in more subdued form. In fact, there was briefly fighting in Lithuania against the Soviet authorities who were trying to bring about collectivization. Of course, the Soviets knew what to expect. They had dealt with resistance previously, and they had pretty tough ways of dealing with it and suppressing it. Still, as late as 1950, there are complaints discussed by the highest levels of the party about the slowness with which collectivization was proceeding in the Baltic states. Now, in Western Ukraine, this is interesting to me, there was a very powerful nationalist movement, and in fact a guerrilla campaign, which for a long time frustrated Soviet authorities. I want to briefly characterize this campaign, so far as I understand it, and maybe alert you to some possible causes. The Ukraine can be considered a place divided down the middle, with Kiev approximately the geographic center. To the eastern part of the Ukraine, one has a presence of ethnic Russians, great Russians. And the further east one proceeds, the higher the concentration of those great Russians. To the west of Kiev, the number of Great Russians is progressively fewer. The number of Ukrainians and other peoples grows very large. As you get, of course, close to Poland, the number of Poles increases. Now, in this area of western Ukraine, people were very inhospitable towards the Soviet power, which they identified with Russian power. They were anti-Russian and anti-Soviet, many of them. This was a territory that was occupied for a long time by the Nazis. And so the Ukrainians there in the West had had a long experience with an alternative. I'm sure they didn't like it very much, but they saw that while the Nazis were disagreeable, they were different in some respects than the Soviets, and this may have steeled them against the Soviets. They hated both of them. At any rate, in 1944, there was established, mainly in western Ukraine, a band of partisans, numbering possibly as large as 10,000 partisans. And this number in 1945 may have grown larger. That is, 1945 is a period when already the Red Army had overrun the territory, so it was, the western Ukraine was returned to Soviet authority. Now, all the way until 1953, the Soviet authorities had difficulties dealing with the partisan movement in the West Ukraine. By night, the countryside was controlled by the partisans. Security officials from the NKVD, who sent troops, border control units, and so on, had to fear for their lives because the Ukrainians set ambushes for them, and there were areas in the Ukraine to which these security forces dared not venture. There was, in fact, something approaching an unconventional war on a large scale in western Ukraine. Now, this is not, to my knowledge, very widely known. It is not the subject of many large books. And only recently have certain important archival materials become available. A man called Jeff Birds at the University of Rochester has managed to get hold of archives from KGB that for the first time reveal the extent of the Soviet troop commitment to suppression of the partisan rebellion in Ukraine. The situation in Ukraine was complicated by the food shortfall there from 1946 to 48. In fact, there was another famine. We know it was a quite serious famine. Khrushchev, who was first party secretary of the Ukraine, that is, he was the principal party person in Ukraine at this time, was alarmed enough by the food situation that he dared to approach Stalin and demand that food relief be sent from the center to Ukraine. Stalin, incidentally, this is described in Khrushchev's memoirs, was very unreceptive to this request for assistance from Khrushchev, virtually dismissed it without a comment. And Khrushchev had reason to fear that by pressing the case for food relief that he might be relieved of his position, and maybe more than his position. He survived, maybe because Stalin perversely liked his outspokenness. God only knows why. In other respects, Khrushchev was quite a willing tool of Stalin, so maybe that was the reason. But our point is, as we assess the situation in the Ukraine, it was from the point of view of the people of Ukraine and the point of view of the Moscow government none too pretty. Between 1944, when Soviet troops again established their control in Ukraine, and roughly 1951, there was a concerted attempt by the Soviet authorities to root out the Uniat Church. Now, the Uniat Church is for many Ukrainians a religious home. It is a hybrid church, a hybrid between Russian Orthodoxy and Catholicism, that is Roman Catholicism. The Uniat Church preserved the Orthodox rituals, ways of saying Mass, the vestments, and so on and so forth, but the authorities within the church owed allegiance to Rome. Now, this strange church developed because it was on the borderland of two larger religious civilizations. Toynbee tells us in his study of history that religions are always the bases of civilizations, an interesting observation that's probably falsified in the modern world in any number of cases. But anyway, he says it, and it's maybe true for the ancient world. Ukraine was on the borderland of the Western religious community or civilization, which is arguably centered in Rome for much of the preceding centuries, and the Russian Orthodox or Byzantine civilization. And so it's natural that there a hybrid church, this Uniat church, should come into existence. Now, because it was so closely associated with the national identity of Ukrainians as separate from the Orthodox, and because it was worrisome to Stalin after the war that anybody had allegiance to an outside power, especially the Pope in Rome, this church had to be systematically suppressed. And so by 1951, the Uniat church had been virtually forced underground. It had ceased to exist as a publicly operating religious community. Finally, we must mention that there were about 300,000 deportations from Ukraine to prison camps and to exile, points of exile from Ukraine in these years. So this was a very serious problem on the Soviet periphery, and it is, in fact, a crisis that the regime found itself attending to. Now, throughout this post-war period, Soviet agriculture was in a state of difficulty, and I will not spend a long time about this, but I do want to mention it. 1946, there was a severe drought. It affected the Volga region. It affected Ukraine. The result was, in part, the famine in Ukraine, the beginning of it that I've already talked about. Khrushchev himself, who visited the countryside in 1946, witnessed a peasant woman in the process of cooking one of her children who had died during this famine. So the same kinds of survival strategies, if we can call them that, occurred in the 46 famine as had occurred in the terror famine in 32-33. Khrushchev's conclusion is the poor woman has simply lost her mind. You know, that was the conclusion he drew. Politically, the harvest shortfalls, which accumulated like raindrops of bad news in Moscow, had an effect in 1948. A charlatan who claimed to be a plant scientist, a zoologist, a great man who knew Marxist science as opposed to bourgeois science, a man called Trofim Lysenko, said that the old theories of plant, of fertilization of fields and planting and animal husbandry need to be disregarded, and that the Soviet Union should embrace a truly Marxist, a socialist theory of zoology and of plant reproduction. Lysenko's theory was explicitly anti-Mendelian, anti-Morganist. Morgan was a Columbia geneticist, Columbia University, New York geneticist, who had developed important insights into the ways that traits are passed on, although at this point, of course, DNA was not yet understood. Lysenko's charlatanism, and that's really what it was embraced by the party in 1948. And the damage that this did to Soviet agriculture and to the husbandry of animals is very great. Lysenko had the perverse idea that you could take a meat-producing cow and a milk cow, and you could mate them, and then you would have both a milk producer and a meat-producing cow, because he said the zygote is no fool. The zygote in a social society, don't ask me to explain this. Other people think that you can only maximize one trait by carefully selecting for that trait alone, and that's not the way that Lysenko had it. And until the 1960s, that is for nearly 20 years, Lysenkoism dominated Soviet biology and made the study of modern genetics impossible in the Soviet Union. So in other words, the scientists didn't do very much to help the Soviet Union out of its agrarian crisis. During this whole period, because of the lack of male workers on the farms, because of the destruction of the land, because of the lack of fertilizer, the lack of parts for tractors, productivity of Soviet agriculture was very low. It has been calculated that in terms of yields per hectare, it's a measure of land, that the amount of productivity on farms in the Soviet Union was 6% below the average productivity of Russian farms in 1913, that is, before the revolution. So this was quite unproductive. Peasant income was very low. It took collective farmers about 60 days of work to get enough money to buy a kilogram of butter, a little over 2 pounds of butter. So the countryside folks were dirt poor. How did the government respond to this crisis? Well, not by emergency famine relief in the Ukraine, by no means. Not by demobilizing soldiers right away to get them back to the village, by no means. The government decided, the way it usually did in this period, that bigger is better. It would centralize agricultural production as much as it could by making the collective farms bigger. And incidentally, that would have the virtue of putting those collective farms under the control of party workers, who were fewer in number since so many had been killed during the war. So central control was the answer, and of course this kind of answer was no answer. In the city of the Soviet Union, it's hard to generalize because cities to the east of the Urals weren't touched by the devastation of the war. So just the cities in the fighting zone that suffered so much. And also big cities like Moscow, where people came and crowded into scarce housing space. Somebody did a calculation of the average amount of housing space available to dwellers of apartments. Soviet people tended to live in apartments in the decade before 1953, that is the last years of Stalin's reign. And the calculation says that the average space of an apartment dweller was 4.5 to about 5 square meters. Now, what does this mean? Let's pace this out. It's 1, 2, 1, 2. I don't know if the camera catches this, but this is a pretty small area. And in human terms, what this means is that you have several generational units, 2 or 3, living in crowded apartments. It means that sexual activity goes on without any kind of cover. It means, of course, a coarsening of what you might call people's moral sensibilities. It means the lapse of the sense of privacy, although it probably reinforces powerfully the desire to have some privacy. I mean, people who have lived through this period in the Soviet Union tell me that they tried all of their lives to escape from the kommunalki, the communal apartments, and it was a glorious day when they finally achieved this. The government tried, of course, to build apartments as rapidly as it could, and it did this in all sorts of ways. It threw up, that's the right term, it threw up buildings that were prefabricated, on which the outside there were glued on tiles and brick facings, and they quickly disintegrated. And if you visit any of the big cities in Russia now, you can see these shell remnants of the post-war building spree, jerry-built apartments that now look like disasters. Although at the time they were put up, people were only too happy to live there. In Moscow, this is now the center of the Soviet Empire and the center of an enormous communist worldwide structure of power. There were in the post-war period gestures of a monumental sort in architecture. I speak first and foremost of the so-called Stalin Gothic structures, 7 of them that towered above the skyline, all those beautiful onion dome churches and the classic pre-revolutionary buildings. These enormous thrusting phallic things. Moscow University was one, the Foreign Ministry was another, the Ministry of Transportation still another. They were places of business. Classes were conducted there in the case of the university, but also places of living. Students lived there, and they looked like tiny apartments, but they had amenities. One had, in a 2-room suite, one's own bathroom. And if one was lucky enough to be in a ministry, which was centered in one of these Stalin Gothic spaces, one had high ceilings, one had greater amount of room. And this was important to the government because it showed the might of the Soviet people, and the will of the party was unshakable, was victorious, and could still, despite the war, manifest itself in heroic ways. Aesthetically, I've already given you some indication of how I feel about it, but you know, Warsaw was mostly destroyed in the war, capital of Poland, and in the middle of Warsaw, one of these Stalin Gothic buildings was constructed, and the Poles used to say that from the top of that building you had the most beautiful view in all of Warsaw, because it's the only place in Warsaw from which you couldn't see the Stalinist Gothic building. So it goes. Let me say something quickly about politics in Stalin's last years. The Soviet Union was incontestably a great power. The term superpower wasn't, to my knowledge, being used quite yet, but it was a great power. It was, however, an insecure great power. In fact, the desire to defend the socialist motherland or fatherland against capitalist invasion and war was more powerful than ever. There was a kind of defense mania that developed in the Soviet leadership and amongst Soviet people. Never again will we permit invasion of our country to happen. That was the mood. And this insecurity, which you could say, well, that's understandable, it leads, as insecurity so often does in interpersonal relationships and international relationship, to aggression. The Soviets made sure that in Poland a communist regime was installed, and in Czechoslovakia, and in Germany. and it welcomed the victory of the Titoist rebels in Yugoslavia, in the Yugoslav Civil War. Now, the process of Sovietization of Eastern Europe wasn't automatic. It was resisted in various places by nationalists. The Polish government in exile, for example, tried to resist the imposition of the Soviet system in Poland. In Czechoslovakia, Eduard Beneš, who had been president of the Republic and now found himself foreign minister, opposed as best he could with all of the craft of a Czech, his mind set on the goal, and the result of his protest, really, against the Sovietization of his country was that he was thrown out of a window. The official story was he committed suicide, but some Czech historians like to refer to this event as the third defenestration of Prague. There were reverses that the Soviets experienced. They tried to choke Berlin, and they were frustrated by an American, principally, but Allied airlift that blocked the attempt to strangle West Berlin. So this struggle to Sovietize the periphery was attended by difficulties, and nevertheless, by the late 40s, the goal had been reached. During this post-war period, there was the Cold War, rivalry with the United States. It's not something that I want to rehearse because it's a complicated subject in its own right. My own theory is the Cold War was implicit from 1917, 1918. The ideological hostility was there in the competition between Lenin and President Wilson and their different theories of self-determination. And incidentally, that same point is made in a long book, and I would say ad nauseum, by the Princeton historian Arno Mayer. So this is nothing new with me. After the war, there was an important, after the Second World War, an important episode in the Cold War, and that was the Soviet decision in 1947 to reject participation in the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, from the Soviet perspective, was a trap initiated by capitalist state, and if the Soviets would participate in this plan, they would be giving up their national sovereignty to American control. It was a kind of ideological trap that had to be resisted, just as Stalin had cast aside the ideological trap of the new economic policy. The Soviets could get away with their hardline strategy because they developed atomic weapons. 1949, the first atom bomb was tested, and then in 1953, the hydrogen bomb was tested in the Soviet Union. And all these programs were well underway in 1945. There was a Center for Atomic Research. Igor Kurchatov and other Soviet physicists led the atomic project, and of course the brilliant Andrei Sakharov was the father, theoretically speaking, of the hydrogen weapon. And with the advent of the atomic bomb, and I would really say the hydrogen bomb, the Soviet Union became a superpower, not just a great power, but a superpower. So if you want the demarcation for that, it would be 1953. Internally, Stalinist politics was more of the same. It was more nationalistic. What was being pressed was a crude Soviet nationalism. It was anti-Semitic, one of the dark secrets of the time, but Stalin was as much of an anti-Semite in some ways as Hitler. It was anti-intellectual, as the doctor's plot on the eve of Stalin's death demonstrates. And when the old man died in March of 1953, there were rumors swirling in Moscow of more purges and more terror. So his reign ended as it had begun.